On the 29th of April 2010, Apple's chief executive Steve Jobs published an open letter saying Flash would never run on the iPhone. Adobe had paid $3.4 billion for Flash and had promised for years that it would run everywhere. That was the entire product. Write it once and it plays on every computer on Earth identically, no matter whose browser or operating system you happen to own. For about a decade, that promise was true, and it was the reason almost every video, every game, and every animation on the web ran through one piece of software owned by one company. Then the most important new computer in the world shipped without it. The promise died in public, and the letter explaining why did not lead with market share or licensing or money. It led with battery life, crashes, and a phrase that turns out to be the actual autopsy. Jobs wrote that he did not want a third-party layer of software sitting between the platform and the developer. That sentence is the whole story, and it is not really about Apple, because you need to understand what Flash was structurally, not just what it did. Flash was a plugin. It was not part of your browser, and it was not part of your operating system. It was a separate runtime made by Adobe that you installed into the gap between them. Inside that runtime, Flash did its own drawing, ran its own programming language, decoded its own video, and managed its own memory. That is an astonishing thing to pull off, and it is exactly why it won. If Flash draws its own pixels, then a Flash animation looks pixel identical on Windows, on a Mac, on any browser, in an era when getting two browsers to agree on the position of a box was genuinely difficult. Adobe bought Macromedia and Flash with it in 2005 for about $3.4 billion, and at the peak, Adobe could credibly claim the player was installed on virtually every internet-connected desktop on the planet. That is close to total victory. And every single property that produced it is also the reason it could not survive contact with a phone. Start with power. Flash decoded video in its own software, inside its own runtime, because that is what being self-contained means. Meanwhile, every phone shipping after about 2008 had dedicated silicon for decoding video, a hardware decoder that does the same work at a fraction of the energy. A plugin sitting above the operating system cannot reach that hardware unless the operating system hands it over. So Flash video burned battery in a way native video did not, and on a phone, battery is not a preference. It is the product. Then touch. Flash was designed in a world of mouse pointers, and enormous amounts of Flash content depended on hovering, menus that open when the cursor passes over them. A finger cannot hover. It is either touching the glass or it is not. So a large share of the existing Flash web was not slow on a touch screen, it was structurally unusable, and rewriting it meant rewriting every site individually. And then security, which is the one that actually ended it. Because Flash was one runtime installed on effectively every computer, a single flaw in it was a skeleton key to the entire Internet, and Flash spent years as one of the most reliably attacked pieces of software on Earth. Now here is the part that gets skipped, and it is the reason I wanted to make this. Every one of those problems was fixable in principle. Hardware decoding, touch input, memory safety. These are hard engineering problems, but they are not impossible ones. The reason they did not get fixed in time is not that Adobe's engineers were bad. It is where Flash sat. Think about who can actually fix a bug in the middle layer. Apple could not patch Flash. It was not their code. Adobe could not ship a patch to your machine. They could only publish one and hope you ran the updater. Your browser vendor could not fix it either, and could not even reliably sandbox it, because the plugin ran with the privileges the operating system gave it, not the ones the browser wanted to give it. So every security hole in Flash needed a coordinated global update from a company with no direct channel to the machines it ran on through users who had learned to click, "Remind me later." A bug in your browser gets fixed when your browser updates. A bug in your operating system gets fixed when your OS updates. A bug in the layer wedged between them gets fixed when a few 100 million people individually agree to do something. So here is the reframe. The standard story is that Steve Jobs killed Flash, and that is satisfying and mostly wrong. Jobs did not create any of those problems. He described them publicly in a letter, and then declined to carry them. What killed Flash is that its winning move and its fatal flaw were the same architectural decision: be a self-contained layer that sits between the platform and the developer. That position is what made it universal. It is precisely because Flash did not depend on the browser or the OS that it could look identical everywhere. And that same position is what made it unmaintainable, because a layer in the middle has no owner with the power to repair it. Apple has authority over the OS. Google and Mozilla have authority over the browser. Nobody has authority over the space in between, except a company whose only lever is asking you to install something. Flash was not beaten by a better product. It was beaten by the arrival of a device where the operating system vendor was unwilling to let anything sit between itself and the developer, and once that position was closed, Flash had nowhere left to be. The ending took another decade, and it was administrative rather than dramatic. Adobe kept trying. There was a Flash player for Android phones, and it was abandoned in 2012. The web standards that replaced it, mostly video and canvas built directly into the browser, were slower and uglier at first, and then inevitably were not, because they had something Flash structurally could not have. They were maintained by the same people who maintained the browser. In July of 2017, Adobe announced the end date, giving the world 3.5 years of notice, which is an unusually graceful way to kill something. Flash Player reached end of life on the 31st of December, 2020, and Microsoft removed the component from Windows. Adobe published a version that actively blocks Flash content from running. The web it built, the games, the animations, a genuine era of Internet culture, mostly survives now only because volunteers wrote emulators to keep it playable, which is its own quiet monument. There is a companion to this, and it is the same architectural mistake made by the company that had the most authority in the world. Microsoft welded its browser directly into Windows, which is the exact opposite of being a plugin, total authority instead of none, and it produced a failure that rhymes, a browser that could only be updated when the operating system was, so the web froze on it for 5 years. If you want the version where owning the layer is the problem instead of not owning it, that story is on the channel now, and the link is on screen.